A Kingdom's Future. Paris, 1919. Elizabeth Garrison sorted through old war documents when she found an envelope sealed with wax. She turned it over and froze. It was addressed to her in Major Nathaniel Blackwood's handwriting. But there was no return address, and the date was smudged beyond recognition. Chapter 1. The Letter with No Address. The attic air hung thick with dust motes, dancing in the lone shaft of sunlight that pierced the gloom. Elizabeth Garrison knelt before a weathered trunk, its brass clasps tarnished with age and neglect. Paris, 1919. The war was over, officially, but the echoes of it still reverberated through the city, through her life. She was sorting through the remnants of her Aunt Mathilde's life, a task she'd been putting off for months. Mathilde, a volunteer nurse during the Great War, had passed away peacefully in her sleep, leaving Elizabeth her sole heir and the daunting responsibility of this Parisian flat and all its contents. Elizabeth brushed a layer of dust from a stack of neatly tied documents, mostly medical records, patient logs, supply requisitions, the mundane detritus of a life dedicated to service. Beneath them, nestled in a corner of the trunk, lay a small, unassuming envelope. It was cream-colored, thick paper, sealed with a blob of faded crimson wax. Her heart gave a small, unexpected lurch. She recognized the handwriting instantly, even after all these years. It was the bold, slightly slanted script of Major Nathaniel Blackwood. She turned the envelope over and over in her hands, a strange tremor running through her. To Mrs. Elizabeth Garrison. Her married name. A name she hadn't used in far too long. There was no return address, only her name, stark and undeniable, penned in his unmistakable hand. The postmark, a blurred smudge of ink, offered no clue to its origin or date. It could have been from any time during the war or even before. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. Before the war that had shattered their lives, their world. Before the secrets and the betrayals, the unspoken promises and the agonizing choices. Before the silence that had stretched between them for years, a vast, unbridgeable chasm. Elizabeth carefully broke the wax seal, the brittle sound loud in the stillness of the attic. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the thick paper. The ink was faded, but the words were clear, each stroke a ghostly echo of the man she had once loved, the man she had thought she knew. My dearest Elizabeth, if you are reading this, it means many things. It means I have failed to find the words, or perhaps the courage, to speak to you directly. It means the shadows have grown too long, and the light is fading. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. The words were cryptic, laced with a sense of melancholy she hadn't associated with Nathaniel. He had always been so resolute, so certain. Even in the face of the horrors they had witnessed together, he had maintained a quiet strength, a steadfastness that had been her anchor. There are things you do not know, Elizabeth. Things I have kept hidden, buried deep beneath the weight of duty, of oaths sworn and promises made. Things that, if revealed, could shatter the fragile peace we have both fought so hard to achieve. Her hand tightened around the letter. What secrets? What oaths? The fragile peace, was he referring to the armistice, to the precarious state of Europe, or to something more personal, something between them? She continued reading, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. I have made choices, Elizabeth, choices that have haunted me every waking moment. Choices that I believed were for the greater good, for the safety of those I swore to protect. But in the darkness, I have come to realize that the greatest good, the only good that truly matters, is the truth. A single tear traced a path down Elizabeth's cheek, landing on the faded ink, blurring the words slightly. The truth. What truth? The truth about his disappearance? The truth about his silence? The truth about the whispers she had heard, the rumors that had circulated after he had been declared missing in action, presumed dead? I know I have hurt you. I know I have broken your trust. And for that, I can offer no excuses, only the desperate hope that one day, you might understand. That one day, you might forgive. Forgive. The word hung in the air, heavy and laden with unspoken pain. Could she forgive him? Could she forgive him for leaving, for vanishing without a trace, for leaving her to pick up the pieces of her shattered life? Could she forgive him for the secrets he had kept, the secrets that were now spilling out from this long-lost letter, threatening to unravel everything she thought she knew? If this letter reaches you, it means I am likely gone. But know this, Elizabeth. Know that every decision I made, every sacrifice I endured, was driven by a love that burned brighter than any star, a love that even the horrors of war could not extinguish. A love for you. The attic seemed to spin around her.
Gone.
He was gone. She had known it, deep down, for years. The official telegram, the condolences, the empty space beside her in the bed they had once shared, they had all pointed to the same inevitable conclusion. But to see it in his own words, in his own hand, made it real, undeniable, a fresh wound ripped open in her heart. I cannot ask you to wait for me, Elizabeth. I cannot ask you to hold onto a ghost. But I can ask you to remember. Remember the moments of light, the stolen kisses, the whispered promises. Remember the love that defied the darkness, the love that the letter ended abruptly, the last word unfinished, the sentence hanging in the air like a lost breath. Elizabeth stared at the blank space, her mind reeling. Remember. It was all he asked. But how could she remember when the memories were so intertwined with pain, with betrayal, with the crushing weight of what might have been? She carefully folded the letter, her hands shaking. The attic, once a place of quiet solitude, now felt like a cage, the dust motes swirling around her like the ghosts of her past. She had to get out. She had to breathe. She rose to her feet, the letter clutched tightly in her hand. As she turned to leave, her gaze fell upon a small, wooden box tucked away in a corner of the trunk. It was intricately carved, with a delicate floral pattern. She didn't recognize it. Hesitantly, she opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a single, silver dog tag. It was engraved with a name and a number. Major Nathaniel Blackwood, 17th Lancers. And beneath it a single dried forget-me-not. Elizabeth gasped, a sob escaping her lips. The forget-me-not, a symbol of remembrance, of enduring love. He had remembered. Even in the face of death, he had remembered. And in that moment, standing in the dusty attic, surrounded by the ghosts of her past, Elizabeth knew that she had a choice to make. She could remain trapped in the shadows, consumed by grief and regret. Or she could step into the light, embrace the truth, and finally uncover the secrets that lay hidden within this letter, within this box, within the heart of the man she had loved, and perhaps still did. Chapter 2. Whispers of Montmartre. The scent of roasting chestnuts and brewing coffee mingled with the exhaust fumes of passing motor cars, a characteristic Parisian blend that usually comforted Elizabeth. Today, however, it only heightened her unease. She clutched the letter and the dog tag in her handbag, their presence a palpable weight against her thigh as she navigated the bustling streets of Montmartre. She had left the quiet, suffocating confines of her aunt's flat with a singular, almost desperate purpose, to find someone who might shed light on Nathaniel's cryptic words, on the secrets he had hinted at in his letter. And there was only one person she could think of who might know something, someone who had moved in the same shadowy circles as Nathaniel during the war, Madame Sylvie Dubois. Sylvie Dubois had been a renowned chanteuse before the war, her voice a smoky, seductive whisper that had filled the cabarets of Montmartre. During the war, she had used her connections, her charm, and her seemingly innocuous position to gather information for the French resistance. Elizabeth had met her through Nathaniel, a brief, almost fleeting encounter, but she remembered Sylvie's sharp eyes, her knowing smile, and the way she seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. The Le Chat Noir, the cabaret where Sylvie had once reigned supreme, was still there, though its facade was faded, its once vibrant colors muted by years of war and neglect. Elizabeth hesitated on the threshold, the faint strains of a piano melody drifting out into the street. It had been years since she had stepped foot in a place like this. The war had changed her, stripped away her youthful naivete, leaving her with a weariness that settled deep in her bones. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the heavy oak door and entered. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of stale cigarette smoke and cheap perfume. A few patrons sat scattered at the small, round tables, their faces obscured by the shadows. The pianist, a thin man with a weary face, played a melancholic tune that seemed to echo Elizabeth's own mood. She approached the bar, her heels clicking softly on the worn wooden floor. The bartender, a burly man with a handlebar mustache, looked up from polishing a glass. "Madam?" he inquired, his voice gruff but not unkind. "I am looking for Madame Dubois," Elizabeth said, her voice slightly unsteady. "Sylvie Dubois." The bartender's eyes narrowed slightly. "Madame Dubois is not performing tonight." Elizabeth knew what he meant. Sylvie was no longer the star she once was. Time and the war had taken their toll. "I know," she said. "But I need to speak with her. It's important. It's about a friend. Major Nathaniel Blackwood." The mention of Nathaniel's name seemed to have an effect. The bartender's expression changed, a flicker of recognition, perhaps even caution, in his eyes. He glanced around the room, as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Wait here," he said, his voice low. He disappeared through a curtained doorway behind the bar. Elizabeth waited, her heart pounding. The minutes stretched on, each one an eternity. The piano music continued, its mournful melody weaving a tapestry of sorrow and longing. She clutched her handbag tighter, the letter and the dog tag pressing against her palm. Finally, the bartender returned. "Follow me," he said. He led her through the curtained doorway, down a narrow, dimly lit corridor, and up a flight of creaking stairs. The air here was even thicker, heavy with the scent of dust and decay. They stopped before a door at the end of the hallway. The bartender knocked softly. A voice, raspy but still retaining a hint of its former allure, called out, "Entrez." The bartender opened the door and gestured for Elizabeth to enter. She stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The room was small, sparsely furnished, with a single window overlooking a narrow, cobblestone alleyway. Sylvie Dubois sat in a worn armchair, a shawl draped around her shoulders, a cigarette smoldering in an ashtray on a nearby table. She was older, her face lined, her hair streaked with gray, but her eyes still held that same sharp, penetrating gaze. "Elizabeth," Sylvie said, her voice a husky whisper. "It has been a long time." Elizabeth nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The sight of Sylvie, the memories of the past, the weight of Nathaniel's letter, it all seemed to overwhelm her. I received a letter," Elizabeth finally managed to say, her voice trembling. "From Nathaniel." Sylvie's eyebrows rose slightly. "From Nathaniel? But he is dead," Elizabeth finished for her. "I know. But the letter, it was written before. He said there were things I didn't know. Secrets." Sylvie leaned forward, her gaze intense. "And you think I might know something about these secrets?" Elizabeth nodded. "You were connected. During the war. You knew things. You heard things." Sylvie took a long drag from her cigarette, the smoke curling around her face like a veil. "The war," she said softly, "was a time of secrets. A time of lies. A time when even the closest of friends could betray one another." A chill ran down Elizabeth's spine. Betrayal. The word echoed in her mind, resonating with the unspoken fears that had haunted her for years. Had Nathaniel been betrayed? Had he been a victim of some elaborate wartime conspiracy? "He mentioned oaths," Elizabeth said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Promises made. He said he had made choices for the greater good." Sylvie nodded slowly. Nathaniel was a man of honor, a man of duty. He would have done anything to protect his country, his comrades. But at what cost? Elizabeth asked, her voice rising in desperation. What did he sacrifice? What did he hide? Sylvie looked at her for a long moment, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and understanding. "Some secrets," she said softly, "are best left buried, Elizabeth. Some wounds are too deep to heal." "But I need to know," Elizabeth insisted. "I need to understand. I need to know why he left." Why he disappeared. Sylvie sighed. A long, weary sound. Nathaniel was involved in delicate matters, Elizabeth. Matters of intelligence. Matters of national security. He was working with certain individuals who were not always what they seemed. Elizabeth's heart sank. She had suspected as much. Nathaniel had always been secretive about his work, even before the war. But to hear it confirmed, to know that he had been involved in such dangerous, clandestine activities, it made her realize how little she had truly known about the man she had loved. There was a rumor, Sylvie said, her voice dropping to a whisper. A rumor that he had discovered something that could have changed the course of the war. Something that someone very powerful wanted to keep hidden. Elizabeth felt a cold dread creep into her heart. A rumor. A secret. A powerful enemy. It all sounded like something out of a spy novel, yet she knew, with a chilling certainty, that it was all too real. Who? Elizabeth asked, her voice trembling. Who wanted to silence him? Sylvie hesitated, her eyes darting towards the window, as if checking for unseen listeners. I cannot say, she whispered. It is too dangerous. Even now, even after the war, there are those who still hold power, those who would do anything to protect their secrets. Elizabeth felt a surge of frustration, of anger. But I have to know, she insisted. I have to know what happened to him. Sylvie looked at her, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. Perhaps, she said softly, you already know more than you think, Elizabeth. Perhaps the answers you seek are closer than you realize. She glanced towards Elizabeth's handbag, her gaze lingering on the outline of the letter and the dog tag. Perhaps, she added, a hint of warning in her voice, the past is best left undisturbed. The unsettling weight of Sylvie's words seemed to hang between them, a palpable tension that felt both heavy and foreboding. Chapter 3. The Shadow of the Somme. Sylvie's words, perhaps the past is best left undisturbed, echoed in Elizabeth's mind as she left Le Chat Noir. The Parisian night had grown colder, a damp chill seeping into her bones, mirroring the unease that had settled deep within her. The encounter with Sylvie had yielded more questions than answers, stirring up a murky past she had tried so hard to bury. Elizabeth walked aimlessly for a while, her thoughts a chaotic jumble of memories and suspicions. She found herself drawn towards the Seine, the river flowing dark and silent beneath the bridges, its surface reflecting the flickering gaslights like scattered stars. She leaned against the stone embankment, the cold seeping through her coat, and stared into the water, her mind drifting back to the war, to the time when she had first met Nathaniel. It had been in the summer of 1915 at a military hospital near Amiens. Elizabeth had volunteered as a nurse, driven by a sense of duty, a need to contribute to the war effort, and perhaps a subconscious desire to escape the stifling confines of her privileged upbringing. Nathaniel had been a patient, recovering from a shrapnel wound to his leg, sustained during the fighting on the Somme. The Somme. The name itself was synonymous with death, with unimaginable horror. Elizabeth had seen the evidence of it firsthand, the endless stream of wounded and dying soldiers, the shattered bodies, the haunted eyes. She had learned to steel herself against the constant onslaught of suffering, to build a wall around her emotions, to focus on the practical tasks of tending to wounds, administering medication, offering comfort where she could. But Nathaniel had been different. He had been one of the lucky ones, his wound relatively minor, his spirit unbroken. He had a quiet strength, a resilience that had drawn her to him. He had a way of making her laugh, even in the midst of the surrounding despair. He had seen the darkness, the same darkness that she had witnessed, but he hadn't let it consume him. She remembered their first conversation, hesitant at first, then gradually opening up, sharing their fears, their hopes, their dreams for a future beyond the war. He had spoken of his love for horses, of his family estate in the English countryside, of his desire to return to a life of peace and tranquility. She had spoken of her passion for art, of her longing to travel, to see the world, to experience life beyond the confines of her social circle. They had found solace in each other's company, a brief respite from the horrors of the hospital. They had stolen moments together, whispered conversations in the dimly lit wards, shared laughter over a cup of lukewarm tea, fleeting touches that had sent shivers down her spine. They had fallen in love, quickly, intensely, a love born out of shared experience, out of a desperate need for connection in a world that seemed to be falling apart. Elizabeth pulled the letter from her handbag, the paper now crumpled and worn from her constant handling. She unfolded it again, her eyes scanning the familiar words, searching for clues, for some hidden meaning that she might have missed. There are things you do not know, Elizabeth. Things I have kept hidden. What were those things? What secrets had he been carrying? Sylvie's words about intelligence work, about a dangerous discovery, about a powerful enemy, they all pointed to a world of espionage, of deception, a world that Nathaniel had inhabited but had never shared with her. She remembered the times he had been evasive, the times he had changed the subject when she had asked about his work, the times he had disappeared for days, sometimes weeks, without explanation. She had attributed it to the demands of his military duties, to the secrecy that was inherent in wartime. She had trusted him. She had believed in him. But now she wondered if her trust had been misplaced. Had he been lying to her all along? Had their love been built on a foundation of secrets and lies? The thought was like a knife twisting in her gut. She had given him her heart, her soul. She had risked everything for him. And now, she was left with nothing but a letter, a dog tag, and a growing sense of unease. She closed her eyes, trying to conjure up his image, to remember the feel of his hand in hers, the warmth of his smile, the sound of his laughter. But the memories were fading, blurred by time and doubt. The man she had loved, the man she thought she knew, was becoming a stranger, a ghost shrouded in mystery. A sudden sound startled her, the distant rumble of thunder. She looked up at the sky, the clouds gathering overhead, dark and ominous. A storm was brewing, both literally and figuratively. The wind picked up, whipping her hair around her face, the first drops of rain beginning to fall. Elizabeth knew she couldn't stay there, lost in her memories, paralyzed by her doubts. She had to keep moving, keep searching. She had to find the truth, no matter how painful it might be. She folded the letter and put it back in her handbag, along with the dog tag. She straightened her shoulders, took a deep breath, and turned away from the river. The rain was falling harder now, soaking through her coat, plastering her hair to her face. But she didn't care. She had a purpose, a mission. She was going to find out what had happened to Nathaniel Blackwood, even if it meant confronting the darkest secrets of the war, even if it meant risking her own life. The chilling rain intensified as if the heavens wept with her, and she pressed forward into the gloom, the growing storm an ominous mirror to the tempest brewing in her heart and the increasingly dangerous path before her. Chapter 4. A Rendezvous at the Gare du Nord. The rain was relentless, a torrential downpour that turned the streets of Paris into shimmering rivers. Elizabeth, drenched and shivering, finally reached the Gare du Nord, the vast railway station a chaotic scene of bustling crowds, hissing steam engines, and echoing announcements. She had followed a slender thread of information, a name whispered by Sylvie Dubois in the smoky confines of Le Chat Noir. Henri Leblanc. Leblanc, Sylvie had said, was a former railway worker, a man with connections to the resistance, a man who had known Nathaniel Blackwood, a man who might know something about his disappearance. He frequented a small café near the station, Le Rendezvous de Cheminots, a place where railway workers gathered to drink, gossip, and share information. Elizabeth pushed open the door of the café, the smell of strong coffee, tobacco smoke, and damp while hitting her like a physical force. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with noise and conversation. Men in work clothes, their faces grimy with soot and sweat, sat at the tables, talking loudly, arguing, laughing. She hesitated for a moment, feeling out of place, a woman alone in this masculine domain. But the urgency of her quest, the burning need to uncover the truth about Nathaniel, propelled her forward. She approached the bar, her eyes scanning the faces, searching for someone who might fit Sylvie's description of Leblanc, a short, stocky man with a limp, a scar above his left eye, and a perpetually cynical expression. The bartender, A tall, thin man with a drooping mustache looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "Madam?" he inquired, his voice barely audible above the din. "I am looking for Henri LeBlanc," Elizabeth said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I was told he might be here." The bartender's eyes narrowed. "LeBlanc? What do you want with him?" Elizabeth hesitated. She couldn't reveal too much, not yet. "It's a personal matter," she said. "A matter concerning a mutual acquaintance. Major Blackwood." The mention of Nathaniel's name, as with Sylvie, seemed to have an effect. The bartender's expression changed, a flicker of recognition, perhaps even fear, in his eyes. He glanced around the room, as if checking for eavesdroppers. "LeBlanc is not here," he said, his voice low. He doesn't come here much anymore." Elizabeth's heart sank. Had she reached another dead end? "But I was told things have changed," the bartender interrupted. "Since the war, people are careful. They don't talk as much, especially about certain matters." Elizabeth understood. The war had left its mark on everyone, leaving a legacy of fear, suspicion, and mistrust. People were afraid to speak out, afraid of the consequences. "But I need to find him," Elizabeth persisted. "It's important. It's about Major Blackwood's disappearance." The bartender hesitated, his eyes searching hers. He seemed to be weighing her words, assessing her sincerity. Finally, he sighed. "LeBlanc, he sometimes comes to the station," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "To watch the trains. He lost his son in the war. A railway worker, like him. Killed in a bombing raid." Elizabeth felt a pang of sympathy for the man. She understood the pain of loss, the emptiness that it left behind. "He sits on the platform," the bartender continued, "near the end, where the trains depart for the front, for the places where his son, where so many others." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Elizabeth knew where he meant. The places of death, of destruction, of unimaginable suffering. The places where Nathaniel had disappeared. "Thank you," Elizabeth said, her voice choked with emotion. She turned to leave, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and trepidation. She made her way through the crowded station, the noise and the chaos fading into a dull roar in her ears. She reached the platform the bartender had indicated, the end of the line, where the tracks stretched out into the darkness, disappearing into the rain-soaked night. And there he was, a short, stocky man, sitting on a bench, his shoulders slumped, his gaze fixed on the tracks. He had a limp, she noticed, as he shifted slightly on the bench. And above his left eye, a thin, white scar, barely visible in the dim light.
Henri Leblanc.
Elizabeth approached him slowly, hesitantly. "Monsieur Leblanc?"
she said softly.
The man looked up, his eyes, bloodshot and weary, meeting hers. He didn't speak, only stared at her, his expression unreadable. "My name is Elizabeth Garrison," she said. I was a friend of Major Nathaniel Blackwood." LeBlanc's expression changed, a flicker of something recognition, perhaps even pain in his eyes. He nodded slowly. "I know who you are," he said, his voice raspy, his accent thick with the sounds of the Parisian working class. "Sylvie sent you." Elizabeth was surprised. "You know Sylvie?" LeBlanc gave a short, bitter laugh.
"We all know Sylvie.
In this part of Paris, everyone knows Sylvie." He gestured for her to sit down beside him on the bench. Elizabeth sat, the cold metal seeping through her wet clothes. The rain continued to fall, a steady drumming on the roof of the station. "You knew Nathaniel," Elizabeth said, her voice low. It wasn't a question, but a statement. LeBlanc nodded. "I knew him. We worked together. During the war." Elizabeth's heart quickened. "What kind of work?" LeBlanc hesitated. "Dangerous work," he said. "Work that cost many lives." He looked out at the tracks, his gaze distant, lost in the past. He was a good man, Nathaniel. A brave man. He risked his life for his country, for his friends. "But he disappeared," Elizabeth said, her voice trembling. "He was declared missing in action."
"Presumed dead."
LeBlanc nodded again. "That is what they said. That is what they wanted everyone to believe." Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" LeBlanc turned to her, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. There are things you do not know, Madame Garrison. Things about the war, about Nathaniel, about the people he was working with. Elizabeth felt a familiar chill run down her spine. It was the same phrase Nathaniel had used in his letter. There are things you do not know. I received a letter from him, Elizabeth said, her voice barely above a whisper. A letter he wrote before he disappeared. LeBlanc's eyebrows rose slightly. A letter? What did it say? Elizabeth hesitated. She wasn't sure how much she could trust this man, this stranger who had known Nathaniel in a world she didn't understand. But she had come this far. She had to take a chance. She told him about the letter, about Nathaniel's cryptic words, about the secrets he had hinted at, about the oaths he had sworn, about the choices he had made. LeBlanc listened intently, his expression unchanging. When she had finished, he remained silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the rain-soaked tracks. Finally, he spoke. Nathaniel was involved in something big, he said, his voice low. Something that could have exposed a network of spies. A network that reached into the highest levels of the French government, of the military. Elizabeth's mind reeled. A network of spies. High-level corruption. It was even worse than she had imagined. He had discovered their plans, LeBlanc continued. He had evidence. He was going to expose them. But he didn't, Elizabeth said, her voice a whisper. He disappeared before he could. LeBlanc nodded. Someone betrayed him. Someone he trusted. Someone who silenced him. The weight of LeBlanc's revelation hung heavy in the air, the rain now a subtle backdrop as the truth slowly emerged, dark and insidious, threatening to engulf them both. Chapter 5. The Spy's Confession. LeBlanc's words hung in the damp air, heavy and suffocating. Someone he trusted. The phrase echoed Elizabeth's deepest fears, confirming the suspicions that had been gnawing at her since she had read Nathaniel's letter. Betrayal. It was the thread that ran through the entire narrative, the constant undercurrent of danger and deceit. Who? Elizabeth asked, her voice barely audible above the rumble of a passing train. Who betrayed him? LeBlanc hesitated, his eyes darting around the platform, as if still wary of unseen listeners. I do not know his name, he said, his voice low. But I know his code name.
Le Corbeau.
The Raven. The Raven. The name sent a shiver down Elizabeth's spine. It sounded ominous, sinister, a fitting moniker for a traitor. What does it mean? She asked. Why that name? LeBlanc shrugged. I do not know. Perhaps because he was a messenger of death. Perhaps because he was always lurking in the shadows. Perhaps because he was a bird of ill omen. He paused, his gaze fixed on the tracks, his mind seemingly lost in the past. Nathaniel, he was close to exposing him. He continued. He had gathered evidence, documents, names. He was going to present it to someone he trusted. Someone in the British intelligence service. But he never made it, Elizabeth said, her voice a whisper. LeBlanc nodded. He was intercepted. Ambushed. His body was never found. The official story, Elizabeth knew, was that Nathaniel had been killed in action during a reconnaissance mission behind enemy lines. But LeBlanc's account painted a different picture, a far more sinister scenario. He had been murdered, silenced by a traitor within his own ranks. The documents, Elizabeth said. What happened to them? LeBlanc shook his head. They disappeared with him. They were never recovered. Elizabeth felt a surge of frustration, of despair. The evidence, the proof that could have exposed the Raven, was gone. Lost forever. But there must be something, she insisted. Some clue, some lead. Someone else who knew. LeBlanc hesitated again. There was one other person, he said slowly. A woman. A contact of Nathaniel's. She was working with him, gathering information. A woman. Elizabeth's heart quickened. Could this be the key? Could this woman hold the answers she was seeking?
Who is she?
Elizabeth asked. Where can I find her? LeBlanc looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and warning. She is dangerous, Madame Garrison. She is involved in things that are best left alone. I don't care, Elizabeth said, her voice firm. I need to find her. I need to know what happened to Nathaniel. LeBlanc sighed, a long, weary sound. Her name is Isabel Moreau, he said. She used to work as a dancer at a cabaret in Pigalle.
Le Paradis Rouge. Le Paradis Rouge.
The Red Paradise. Another cabaret. Another den of secrets and lies. It seemed that Elizabeth's quest was leading her deeper and deeper into the underbelly of Parisian society, into a world of shadows and whispers. But be careful, Madame Garrison, Leblanc warned. Isabel, she is not to be trusted. She has alliances. She plays both sides. She is a survivor. Elizabeth nodded, her mind racing. She knew the risks. She knew the dangers. But she was not afraid. She had come too far to turn back now. Thank you, Monsieur Leblanc, she said, her voice filled with gratitude. You have given me hope. Leblanc looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. Hope, he said softly, is a dangerous thing, Madame Garrison. Especially in times like these. He stood up, his limp more pronounced as he walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Elizabeth watched him go, his words echoing in her mind. Hope is a dangerous thing.
But it was all she had left.
She remained on the platform for a few minutes longer, gathering her thoughts, steeling herself for the next step in her journey. The rain had stopped, the clouds parting to reveal a sliver of moon, casting a pale light on the wet tracks. She knew what she had to do. She had to find Isabel Moreau. She had to uncover the truth about the Raven, about Nathaniel's betrayal, about his death. She stood up, her resolve hardening. She was no longer the naive, sheltered woman she had been before the war. She was a survivor, a fighter. She had faced death, loss, and heartbreak, and she would not be defeated. She left the station, stepping out into the cool night air. The streets of Paris, still glistening with rain, seemed to beckon her forward, promising both danger and discovery. She headed towards Pigalle, towards Le Paradis Rouge, towards the woman who might hold the key to unlocking the secrets of her past, of Nathaniel's fate. As Elizabeth crossed the threshold, the music seemed to change, the atmosphere instantly thick with anticipation and an unspoken challenge, the air itself holding its breath for her next move. Chapter 6. Beneath a Sky of Shells. The Le Paradis Rouge was a stark contrast to the subdued atmosphere of Le Chat Noir. It was a riot of color and sound, a whirlwind of flashing lights, swirling skirts, and raucous laughter. The air was thick with the scent of perfume, sweat, and champagne, a heady mixture that both intoxicated and repelled. Elizabeth, still damp from the rain and feeling increasingly out of place in her somber attire, navigated the crowded dance floor, her eyes searching for Isabel Moreau. She had no clear picture of the woman, only Leblanc's warning, dangerous not to be trusted a survivor. The stage was dominated by a group of dancers, their bodies clad in shimmering costumes, their movements provocative and alluring. The audience, a mix of soldiers, civilians, and well-dressed men with calculating eyes, watched with rapt attention, their faces flushed with excitement. Elizabeth approached the bar, trying to catch the bartender's eye. He was a large, imposing man with a shaved head and a network of tattoos covering his arms. He looked at her with undisguised disdain. "What do you want?" he barked, his voice rough and unwelcoming. "I am looking for Isabel Moreau," Elizabeth said, trying to project an air of confidence she didn't feel. "I was told she works here." The bartender's eyes narrowed. "Isabel? She's not working tonight." Elizabeth's heart sank. Another dead end. She had been so close, so hopeful. "But I need to speak with her," she persisted. "It's important. It's about a mutual acquaintance." She hesitated, unsure whether to mention Nathaniel's name. It had worked before, with Sylvie and Leblanc, but this place, this atmosphere, felt different, more dangerous. "Tell her it's about Le Corbeau," she said, her voice low. The effect was immediate. The bartender's expression changed, his eyes widening slightly, a flicker of fear, perhaps even respect, in his gaze. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You know about the Raven?" Elizabeth nodded, her heart pounding. She was playing a dangerous game, bluffing her way through a world she didn't understand. But she had no choice. "I need to speak with Isabel," she repeated. It's urgent. The bartender hesitated, his eyes scanning the room as if checking for eavesdroppers. Finally, he nodded. Wait here, he said. He disappeared through a door behind the bar. Elizabeth waited, her nerves on edge. The music, the laughter, the swirling dancers, it all seemed to fade into the background. Her senses heightened, her awareness focused on the door through which the bartender had vanished. Minutes stretched into an eternity. She felt eyes on her, watching her, assessing her. She tried to remain calm, to project an air of indifference, but her hands were trembling, her heart racing. Finally, the door opened, and a woman emerged. She was stunning, even more beautiful than Elizabeth had imagined. Tall, slender, with raven black hair cascading down her shoulders, eyes that sparkled like emeralds, and a smile that was both seductive and dangerous. Isabel Morrow. She approached Elizabeth, her movements graceful and fluid, like a panther stalking its prey. She stopped in front of her, her eyes searching hers, assessing her, just as the bartender had done. You asked for me, she said, her voice a husky whisper, her accent tinged with a hint of something exotic. Elizabeth nodded, unable to speak for a moment. She was mesmerized by this woman, by her beauty, by her aura of power and danger. I was told you might be able to help me, Elizabeth finally managed to say. I'm looking for information. About Major Nathaniel Blackwood. Isabel's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something recognition, perhaps even sadness, passed through her eyes. Nathaniel, she said softly. It has been a long time. You knew him, Elizabeth said, her voice trembling. Isabel nodded. We were close.
Once.
He's dead, Elizabeth said, the words catching in her throat. He was murdered. Isabel's eyes darkened. I know. I received a letter from him, Elizabeth continued. A letter he wrote before he disappeared. He mentioned secrets.
Oaths.
A betrayal. Isabel's gaze intensified. And, you think I know something about these secrets? Elizabeth nodded. I was told you were working with him. Gathering information. That you knew about Le Corbeau. Isabel's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold calculation. Le Corbeau, she repeated, her voice a whisper. The Raven. A dangerous name to speak aloud. I need to know who he is, Elizabeth said, her voice firm. I need to know who betrayed Nathaniel. Isabel looked at her for a long moment, her eyes filled with a mixture of suspicion and something else. Something that Elizabeth couldn't quite decipher.
Why?
Isabel asked. Why do you care? Nathaniel is dead. The war is over. Why dredge up the past? Because I loved him, Elizabeth said, her voice filled with emotion. Because he was murdered. Because his killer, his betrayer, is still out there.
Free.
Isabel's expression softened slightly. She seemed to understand, to empathize. Love, she said softly. A powerful motivator, but also a dangerous one. She paused, her gaze drifting towards the stage, where the dancers were still performing, their bodies moving to the rhythm of the music. I knew Nathaniel, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I worked with him. I cared for him. But I also knew he was playing a dangerous game. A game that could cost him his life. He was trying to expose a network of spies, Elizabeth said. A network that reached into the highest levels of the government. Isabel nodded. He had evidence. Documents. Names. He was going to bring them to light. But he was betrayed, Elizabeth said, her voice trembling. By Le Corbeau. Isabel's eyes met hers, a flicker of warning in their depths. Be careful, Madame Garrison, she said. You are treading on dangerous ground. Le Corbeau is powerful, ruthless. He will stop at nothing to protect his secrets. I'm not afraid, Elizabeth said, her voice firm. Though in truth she was. Isabel smiled, a small, sad smile. You should be, she said. But perhaps your courage will be your strength. She reached into a small, beaded purse she carried, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She handed it to Elizabeth. This is a map, Isabel said. A map of a place where Nathaniel used to meet his contacts. A place where he might have hidden something. Something that could lead you to Le Corbeau. The map depicted an area near the front, the trenches still visible, the devastation stark, the very earth seeming to cry out in silent agony. The location stirred a chilling memory in Elizabeth. Chapter 7.
The hospital at Amiens.
The map was crudely drawn, a series of lines and symbols sketched on a piece of torn paper, but Elizabeth recognized the location instantly. It was the site of the military hospital near Amiens, the place where she had first met Nathaniel, the place where their love had blossomed amidst the horrors of war. A wave of memories washed over her, bittersweet and poignant, the scent of antiseptic and blood mingling with the phantom touch of his hand in hers. "Why this place?" Elizabeth asked, her voice trembling. Why would he hide something there? Isabel shrugged, her expression enigmatic. "Perhaps it was a place of significance to him," she said. "A place where he felt safe. A place where he could trust. Or perhaps, Elizabeth thought, it was a place of irony. A place where he had hidden the evidence of betrayal amidst the very symbols of healing and hope. The hospital, a sanctuary for the wounded and dying, had also been a backdrop for espionage and deceit. "What am I looking for?" Elizabeth asked, her eyes scanning the map, trying to decipher the symbols.
"I do not know," Isabel said.
Nathaniel was secretive. He did not share all his plans, even with me. But she hesitated, her gaze flickering towards a specific point on the map, a small circle marked with an X.
"There was a chapel," she said.
A small, ruined chapel, near the hospital. He used to go there.
To pray.
To think. The chapel. Elizabeth remembered it well. It had been a small, stone building, partially destroyed by shellfire, its roof collapsed, its windows shattered. She and Nathaniel had often sought refuge there, escaping the noise and the chaos of the hospital, finding a moment of peace and solitude amidst the surrounding devastation. He might have hidden something there, Isabel continued. In the ruins. Under the rubble. Perhaps in the walls. Elizabeth's heart quickened. It was a long shot, a desperate hope, but it was all she had. She had to go there. She had to see for herself. "Thank you, Isabel," Elizabeth said, her voice filled with gratitude. "You have given me a chance." Isabel looked at her, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and warning. "Be careful, Elizabeth," she said. "Look, Corbeau, he has eyes everywhere. He will know you're looking for him. He will try to stop you." Elizabeth nodded, her resolve hardening. She knew the risks. She knew the dangers. But she was not afraid. She had come too far to turn back now. She had to find the truth, no matter the cost. She left Le Paradis Rouge, stepping out into the cool night air. The streets of Pigalle, still vibrant and alive, seemed to fade into the background, her mind focused on the journey ahead, on the hospital at Amiens, on the ruined chapel, on the secrets that might be hidden there. She hailed a taxi, giving the driver the address of her aunt's flat. She needed to prepare, to gather supplies, to make arrangements. She knew she couldn't do this alone. She needed help, someone she could trust. As the taxi sped through the darkened streets, Elizabeth thought of the people she had met on her quest: Sylvie Dubois, Henri Leblanc, Isabelle Moreau. They had all been touched by the war, by Nathaniel's life and death. They had all offered her pieces of the puzzle, fragments of information, clues that had led her closer to the truth. But there was one person she hadn't yet contacted, one person who had been a close friend of Nathaniel's, a fellow officer, a man who might know more than he had revealed: Captain James Ashworth. Elizabeth had met James during the war, at a social gathering in London, a brief respite from the fighting. He had been charming, witty, and fiercely loyal to Nathaniel. They had shared a bond, a camaraderie forged in the crucible of war. But after Nathaniel's disappearance, James had become distant, withdrawn. He had offered his condolences, of course, but he had seemed reluctant to talk about Nathaniel, to delve into the circumstances of his death. Elizabeth had attributed it to grief, to the trauma of war, but now she wondered if there was more to it. Had James known something? Had he been protecting a secret? She decided to contact him. She had to. He was her last hope, the only person who might be able to help her uncover the full truth about Nathaniel's betrayal and death. When she arrived at her aunt's flat, She went straight to the telephone. She dialed the number for the British Embassy in Paris, her hand trembling. She asked to speak with Captain Ashworth, giving her name and explaining that it was a matter of urgent personal importance. The operator put her on hold, the minutes stretching on, each one an eternity. Finally, a voice came on the line, crisp and formal. Captain Ashworth speaking. Elizabeth took a deep breath. James, she said, her voice slightly unsteady. It's Elizabeth. Elizabeth Garrison. There was a pause, a moment of silence. Elizabeth, he said, his voice sounding surprised, perhaps even wary. It's been a long time. I know, she said, but I need your help. It's about Nathaniel. Another pause, longer this time.
Nathaniel?
He said, his voice guarded. What about him? Elizabeth explained about the letter, about her quest to uncover the truth about his death, about Le Corbeau, about the map Isabelle Moreau had given her. James listened in silence, his breathing the only sound on the line. When she had finished, he remained silent for a long moment. Elizabeth, he said finally, his voice low and serious. This is dangerous. You shouldn't be involved in this. I have to be, she insisted. I need to know what happened to him. I need to find his killer. It's not that simple, James said. There are things you don't understand. Forces at play, powerful people involved. I know, she said. But I'm not afraid. I need your help, James. You were his friend. You owe him this. There was another long pause. Elizabeth held her breath, waiting, hoping. All right, James said finally, his voice resigned. I'll help you. But we need to meet. Somewhere safe.
Somewhere we can talk.
The hospital at Amiens, Elizabeth said, her voice firm.
Tomorrow.
The ruined chapel. James hesitated. Amiens?
He said.
That's a long way. And dangerous. It's where it all began, Elizabeth said. And it's where it might end. There was a moment of silence. And then James spoke, his voice laced with a newfound urgency. Very well, Elizabeth. I'll meet you there. But be careful. And trust no one. The weight of his warning, coupled with the significance of the location, settled upon Elizabeth, a heavy cloak of apprehension and determination. The journey to Amiens would be more than just a physical trip, it would be a pilgrimage into the heart of her past, and potentially, into the very jaws of danger. Chapter 8. Promises etched in glass. The journey to Amiens was a somber one. Elizabeth and James traveled mostly in silence, the countryside rolling past the train windows, a blur of green fields and war-scarred villages. The closer they got to their destination, the more visible the evidence of the conflict became. Shattered buildings, pockmarked roads, and the ever-present cemeteries, their rows of white crosses stretching out like silent armies. Elizabeth had arranged for a car to meet them at the station, a battered old Citroën driven by a local man, taciturn and wary, who seemed to know more than he let on. He drove them through the devastated landscape, the silence broken only by the rumble of the engine and the occasional sigh from James. James had been uncharacteristically quiet since their phone conversation, his usual charm and wit replaced by a brooding intensity. He seemed burdened by a weight of unspoken knowledge, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings, as if expecting danger at every turn. The hospital, or what remained of it, was a haunting sight. It had been heavily shelled during the war, its buildings reduced to rubble, its grounds a wasteland of craters and debris. The chapel, however, stood relatively intact, a testament to its sturdy stone construction, though its roof was partially collapsed and its windows shattered. As they approached the chapel, Elizabeth felt a wave of emotion wash over her, a mixture of grief, nostalgia, and a strange sense of anticipation. This was where she had shared stolen moments with Nathaniel, where they had whispered their hopes and dreams, where they had promised each other a future that had never come to be. They entered the chapel through a gaping hole in the wall, the interior dim and dusty, the air heavy with the scent of decay and damp earth. Sunlight filtered through the shattered stained glass windows, casting colored patterns on the rubble-strewn floor. Elizabeth looked around, her eyes searching for some sign, some clue, some indication of where Nathaniel might have hidden the documents. The walls were bare, the altar broken, the pews overturned. It seemed hopeless, a futile search in a place that had been ravaged by war. James, however, seemed to know where to look. He moved towards the east end of the chapel, where the largest stained glass window had once stood. Only fragments of it remained, shards of colored glass clinging precariously to the stone frame. He reached up and touched one of the larger pieces, a depiction of an angel with outstretched wings. The glass was cracked, its surface covered in dust and grime, but Elizabeth could still make out the intricate details, the delicate brushstrokes, the vibrant colors. "He loved this window," James said softly, his voice filled with a mixture of sadness and reverence. He said it reminded him of hope, of a future beyond the war. He ran his fingers along the edge of the glass, his touch gentle and careful. Then he stopped, his fingers pressing against a small section near the bottom of the frame. "Here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's something behind it." Elizabeth came closer, her heart pounding. She could see it now, a slight bulge in the stone, a small section that seemed different, out of place. James took out a pocket knife and carefully began to pry at the stone, working slowly and deliberately. The mortar crumbled easily, loosened by years of exposure to the elements. After a few minutes, he had managed to dislodge a small piece of stone, revealing a narrow cavity behind it. He reached into the cavity and pulled out a small metal box. It was rusted and dented, its surface covered in dirt and grime, but it was intact. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. This was it. This was what Nathaniel had hidden. James handed the box to Elizabeth, his eyes meeting hers. "Be careful," he said, his voice low and serious. This could change everything." Elizabeth took the box, her hands trembling. She could feel the weight of it, the significance of its contents. This was the key, the answer to all her questions, the truth about Nathaniel's betrayal and death. She opened the box, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a collection of documents, neatly folded and tied with a ribbon. There were letters, photographs, maps, and a small, leather-bound notebook. Elizabeth carefully unfolded one of the letters, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. It was from Nathaniel, addressed to a high-ranking official in the British intelligence service, outlining his discovery of a network of spies operating within the French government and military. He named names, provided evidence, detailed their plans. And at the end of the letter, he identified the leader of the network, the man he called Le Corbeau, the Raven. Elizabeth gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The name, it was someone she knew, someone she had trusted, someone who had been a close friend of Nathaniel's, a fellow officer, Captain James Ashworth. The realization hit her like a physical blow, a wave of shock and disbelief washing over her.
James.
It had been James all along. He had betrayed Nathaniel, murdered him, and then he had pretended to be her friend, her ally, leading her on this wild goose chase, all the while knowing the truth. She looked up at James, her eyes filled with horror and betrayal. He was staring at her, his expression unreadable, his eyes cold and hard. "James," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It was you were Le Corbeau." He didn't deny it. He didn't say a word. He just smiled, a slow, cruel smile that sent a shiver down her spine.
"Why?"
Elizabeth asked, her voice rising in desperation. "Why did you betray him? Why did you kill him?" James shrugged, his expression nonchalant. "He was getting too close," he said. "He was going to expose me. I had to silence him." "But you were his friend," Elizabeth said, her voice choked with emotion. "You were like brothers." James laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Friendship," he said, his voice dripping with cynicism. "Loyalty. Honor. They are just words, Elizabeth. Empty words. In this world, in this war, the only thing that matters is survival. Power." He took a step towards her, his hand reaching inside his coat. Elizabeth knew what he was reaching for. A gun. He was going to kill her, just as he had killed Nathaniel. She stood frozen, paralyzed by fear, her mind racing. She had to do something, anything. She couldn't let him win. She couldn't let him get away with this. As he drew the gun, a glint of metal flashing in the dim light, Elizabeth reacted instinctively. She threw the metal box at him, hitting him squarely in the face. He staggered back, momentarily stunned, the gun falling from his hand. Elizabeth seized the opportunity. She lunged forward, grabbing the gun before he could recover. She pointed the gun at him, her hand shaking, her finger on the trigger. She had never held a gun before, never thought she could kill anyone. But in that moment, staring into the eyes of her betrayer, of Nathaniel's murderer, she knew she could. She had to. The chapel fell silent, save for their ragged breaths, the weight of the past, of betrayal, of lost love, hanging heavy in the air, the shattered stained glass a silent witness to the unfolding drama.
Chapter 9.
The betrayal of Captain Dubois. The silence in the chapel was shattered only by the ragged breathing of Elizabeth and James, the gun trembling in her hand. She had never pointed a weapon at anyone before, and the weight of the cold metal felt alien, terrifying. Yet, a fierce determination burned within her, fueled by grief, betrayal, and a desperate need for justice. "You won't shoot," James said, his voice regaining its composure, a smirk playing on his lips. He had recovered from the blow of the metal box, a trickle of blood running down his forehead. "You don't have it in you." Elizabeth's finger tightened on the trigger. She could feel the resistance, the infinitesimal pressure that separated life from death. Her mind flashed back to the hospital wards, to the faces of the dying soldiers, to the constant presence of mortality that had permeated her life during the war. She had seen death, she had held it in her hands. And now, it stared back at her from the eyes of the man she had once considered a friend. "You killed him," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "You killed Nathaniel. And you would have killed me too." "He was a fool," James said, his voice devoid of remorse. He was blinded by his naive ideals, his misplaced loyalty. He didn't understand the game. He didn't understand the stakes. "The stakes?" Elizabeth retorted, her anger rising. "What stakes? Money? Power? What could possibly be worth betraying your friend, your country?" James laughed, a cold, cynical sound that echoed through the ruined chapel. "You wouldn't understand, Elizabeth. You're too innocent, too sentimental. You still believe in things like honor and duty. They are illusions, convenient fictions that keep the masses in line." He took a step towards her, his eyes fixed on hers, challenging her.
"Go on," he said. "Shoot."
"Prove me wrong. Show me that you're not just another naive woman, blinded by love and grief." Elizabeth hesitated. Her finger trembled on the trigger. Could she do it? Could she take a life, even the life of a man who deserved to die? She thought of Nathaniel, of his gentle smile, his unwavering kindness, his belief in a better world. She thought of the letter, of his desperate plea for the truth, of his unwavering love for her. And in that moment, she knew she couldn't do it. Not because she was weak, not because she was afraid, but because she was not like him. She would not stoop to his level. She would not become a murderer. But she wouldn't let him go free either. She lowered the gun slightly, aiming at his leg. "I won't kill you," she said, her voice steady now, resolute. "But I won't let you escape. You will face justice, James. You will pay for your crimes." She pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the chapel, deafeningly loud. James cried out in pain, clutching his leg, collapsing to the floor. Elizabeth stood over him, the gun still pointed at him, her body shaking with adrenaline. She had done it. She had stopped him. But it wasn't over. Not yet. She knew she had to get out of there, to get help, to expose James and his network of spies. She had the evidence, the documents in the metal box, the proof of his betrayal. She backed away slowly, keeping the gun trained on James. He was writhing on the floor, moaning in pain, his face contorted in agony. As she reached the entrance of the chapel, she heard a noise behind her, a faint rustling sound. She turned quickly, her heart pounding, the gun raised. Standing in the doorway was a figure, silhouetted against the light. A figure she recognized. Sylvie Dubois. Elizabeth stared at her, her mind reeling.
Sylvie?
What was she doing here? Sylvie stepped into the chapel, her eyes fixed on James, who was still lying on the floor, clutching his leg. She had a small, automatic pistol in her hand, pointed at him. Sylvie? Elizabeth said, her voice questioning, confused. What's going on? Sylvie didn't answer. She walked towards James, her movements slow and deliberate, her expression cold and hard. Le Corbeau, she said, her voice a low, menacing whisper. You thought you could get away with it. You thought you could silence everyone. James looked up at her, his eyes filled with fear. Sylvie, he said, his voice pleading. What are you doing? I am finishing what Nathaniel started, she said. I am exposing you. I am bringing you to justice. Elizabeth was stunned. Sylvie, she was working with Nathaniel? She was part of his plan to expose the spy network? But you told me to leave it alone, Elizabeth said, her voice trembling. You said it was too dangerous. Sylvie turned to her, her eyes softening slightly. I had to protect you, Elizabeth, she said. I knew James was watching you. I knew he would try to stop you. But how did you know? Elizabeth asked. How did you know about all of this? Sylvie smiled, a small, sad smile. I have my sources, she said. I have my connections. I knew about Nathaniel's investigation. I knew about Le Corbeau. I knew about James. She turned back to James, her expression hardening again. It's over, James, she said. You're finished. She raised her pistol, aiming it at his head. Elizabeth gasped, horrified. She couldn't watch. She turned away, closing her eyes, waiting for the inevitable. But the gunshot never came. Instead, she heard a different sound, a muffled thud, a groan of pain. She opened her eyes cautiously. Sylvie was standing over James, her pistol still raised, but she hadn't shot him. She had struck him with the butt of the gun, knocking him unconscious. He's not worth killing, Sylvie said, her voice filled with disgust. He will face a trial. He will be exposed. He will rot in prison. Elizabeth let out a long, shaky breath. It was over. Finally, it was over. Sylvie turned to her, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and sadness. You did well, Elizabeth, she said. You were brave. You honored Nathaniel's memory. Elizabeth nodded, tears streaming down her face. She had done it. She had uncovered the truth, exposed the traitor, and brought justice to Nathaniel. But the victory felt hollow, bittersweet. Nathaniel was still gone, and the scars of the war, the scars of betrayal, would remain forever. The chapel, silent once more, stood as a testament to the enduring power of truth and the enduring pain of loss, the shattered windows reflecting not only the sky, but the fractured pieces of their lives, forever altered by the events that had unfolded within its walls. Chapter 10. A Dance Before Dawn. The aftermath of the confrontation in the chapel was a blur of activity. Sylvie, surprisingly efficient and resourceful, arranged for James to be taken into custody by local authorities, ensuring his injuries were tended to before he was transported to Paris for interrogation. Elizabeth, still reeling from the shock of James's betrayal and Sylvie's unexpected intervention, cooperated with the officials, providing them with the evidence from the metal box, the documents that would seal James's fate and expose the network of spies he had led. The news of Captain James Ashworth's arrest as Le Corbeau sent shockwaves through the British and French intelligence communities. The subsequent investigation uncovered a web of corruption and deceit that reached into the highest levels of government and military, leading to a series of arrests and trials that would dominate the headlines for months to come. Elizabeth, hailed as a heroine for her role in uncovering the conspiracy, found herself thrust into the public eye, her story splashed across newspapers and magazines. She received letters of gratitude from countless individuals, including government officials, military leaders, and ordinary citizens who had been touched by Nathaniel's life and death. But the publicity, the accolades, the recognition, they meant little to her. She had achieved justice for Nathaniel, but it had come at a heavy price. The emotional toll of the past few weeks had left her drained, exhausted, and deeply scarred. Sylvie, who had remained a steadfast presence throughout the ordeal, encouraged Elizabeth to take some time to heal, to rest, to find some peace after the storm. She offered her support, her friendship, and a quiet understanding that only someone who had lived through the horrors of war could provide. One evening, as the city of Paris began to stir back to life, the scars of war slowly fading but still visible, Sylvie suggested they visit a small, intimate jazz club in the Latin Quarter, a place where she often went to escape the memories and find solace in the music. Elizabeth was hesitant at first. She hadn't felt like socializing, like venturing out into the world. But Sylvie's gentle persistence, her insistence that life had to go on, that joy could still be found amidst the sorrow, persuaded her. The club, Le Caveau de la Huchette, was tucked away in a narrow, cobblestone street, its entrance marked by a small, unassuming sign. The interior was dimly lit, the air filled with the scent of cigarette smoke, wine, and a hint of something sweet, like jasmine. The music, a soulful blend of blues and jazz, washed over Elizabeth, soothing her frayed nerves, easing the tension in her shoulders. They found a small table near the back, away from the dance floor, where a few couples were swaying to the music, their bodies close, their movements intimate. Sylvie ordered a bottle of wine, and they sat in silence for a while, listening to the music, letting the atmosphere envelop them. "It's good to be out," Sylvie said, her voice soft, her eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight. "To be alive." Elizabeth nodded, her gaze drifting towards the dance floor. She watched the couples, their movements graceful and fluid, their faces expressing a mixture of joy, longing, and connection. She felt a pang of envy, a longing for something she had lost, something she feared she might never find again. "Do you dance, Elizabeth?" Sylvie asked, her voice breaking through her thoughts. Elizabeth hesitated. I used to," she said, "before the war. But it's been a long time." "The war changed everything," Sylvie said, her voice filled with a familiar sadness. "But it didn't change the need for connection, the need for love." She smiled, a small, encouraging smile.
"Come," she said.
"Let's dance." Elizabeth was surprised. She hadn't expected this. But Sylvie's invitation, her gentle insistence, stirred something within her, a flicker of hope, a desire to feel alive again. She allowed Sylvie to lead her onto the dance floor. The music, a slow, romantic ballad, seemed to wrap around them, drawing them into its embrace. Sylvie, surprisingly strong and graceful, guided her movements, leading her through the steps. Elizabeth closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her, letting herself be carried away by the rhythm. She felt a sense of release, a letting go of the tension, the grief, the fear that had been consuming her. For a few precious moments, she forgot about the war, about Nathaniel, about James, about the secrets and the betrayals. She was just a woman, dancing in a dimly lit club, feeling the music in her soul, feeling alive. As the song ended, she opened her eyes, her gaze meeting Sylvie's. Sylvie smiled, her eyes filled with warmth and understanding. "Better?" she asked softly. Elizabeth nodded, a small smile forming on her lips. "Better," she said. They returned to their table, feeling a sense of connection, a shared understanding that transcended words. They talked for hours, sharing stories, memories, and laughter. Elizabeth found herself opening up to Sylvie, revealing things she had never told anyone before, sharing the depths of her grief, her fears, and her hopes for the future. Sylvie listened patiently, offering her support, her wisdom, and a quiet strength that helped Elizabeth to feel less alone. As the evening drew to a close, the club emptying, the musicians packing up their instruments, Elizabeth felt a sense of gratitude, a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. She had found a friend in Sylvie, a kindred spirit, someone who understood the scars of war, the pain of loss, and the enduring power of hope. They left the club, stepping out into the cool night air. The streets of Paris, quiet and still, seemed to hold a promise of a new day, a new beginning. "Thank you, Sylvie," Elizabeth said, her voice filled with emotion. "For everything." Sylvie smiled, her eyes sparkling in the moonlight. "It is I who should thank you, Elizabeth," she said. "You have reminded me that even in the darkest of times, there is always light. There is always hope." They embraced, a long, heartfelt embrace that spoke volumes. As they parted, Elizabeth knew that she was not alone. She had a friend, a confidant, someone who would stand by her side, no matter what the future held. As Elizabeth walked back to her aunt's flat, the first rays of dawn beginning to paint the sky with hues of pink and gold, she felt a sense of renewal, a sense of possibility. The war had taken much from her, but it had also given her something, a strength she never knew she possessed, a resilience that would carry her through the challenges ahead, and a newfound appreciation for the preciousness of life, of love, of friendship. The faint sound of the city awakening, mixed with the lingering melody from the jazz club, seemed to whisper a promise of healing, of new beginnings, of a future where joy might once again outweigh sorrow. Chapter 11. The Missing Dispatch. The weeks following James Ashworth's arrest were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, press conferences, and official inquiries. Elizabeth, though weary of the constant attention, cooperated fully with the authorities, providing testimony and evidence that helped to dismantle the extensive spy network that had operated within the French government and military. As the dust began to settle and the public furor subsided, Elizabeth found herself increasingly drawn back to the contents of the metal box, to the documents that Nathaniel had hidden in the ruined chapel. She had read through them countless times, poring over every detail, searching for some hidden clue, some missing piece of the puzzle. One document, in particular, kept capturing her attention. It was a coded dispatch, a series of numbers and letters that seemed to make no sense. She had shown it to the intelligence officials, but they had dismissed it as insignificant, claiming it was likely a routine communication, unrelated to the main conspiracy. But Elizabeth had a nagging feeling that it was important, that it held some key to understanding the full extent of Nathaniel's investigation. She remembered his meticulous nature, his attention to detail, his habit of leaving nothing to chance. He wouldn't have hidden this dispatch with the other documents unless it had some significance. She spent hours trying to decipher the code, using various methods, consulting books on cryptography, even seeking the advice of a former codebreaker who had served during the war. But all her efforts proved futile. The code remained stubbornly resistant, its secrets locked away. One afternoon, feeling frustrated and defeated, Elizabeth decided to visit the Archives Nationales, the central repository of historical documents in Paris. She hoped that she might find some information there, some clue that could help her unlock the code. The archives were a vast and imposing building, filled with endless rows of shelves, stacked with centuries of accumulated documents, records, and correspondence. Elizabeth felt overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information, the weight of history that surrounded her. She spent hours searching through the archives, consulting with archivists, examining old maps, military records, and intelligence reports. She found some information about Nathaniel's unit, his movements during the war, but nothing that shed any light on the coded dispatch. As the day drew to a close, Elizabeth was about to give up, feeling discouraged and disheartened. She had reached another dead end, another wall in her seemingly endless quest. As she was leaving, she noticed a small, unassuming display case near the exit. It contained a collection of artifacts from the war, including weapons, uniforms, medals, and a small, leather-bound notebook. Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. She recognized the notebook instantly. It was identical to the one she had found in the metal box, the one that had belonged to Nathaniel. She approached the display case, her eyes fixed on the notebook. A small plaque beneath it identified it as belonging to a Captain Jean-Luc Dubois, a French intelligence officer who had been killed in action during the final months of the war. Captain Dubois. The name rang a bell. Elizabeth searched her memory, trying to place it. Then it hit her.
Sylvie
Dubois. Was it possible? Could this Captain Dubois be related to her? She asked one of the archivists about the notebook, about Captain Dubois. The archivist confirmed her suspicion. Captain Jean-Luc Dubois was Sylvie's brother. He had been a highly respected officer, known for his bravery and his intelligence work. He had been posthumously awarded the Légion d'honneur, France's highest military honor. Elizabeth felt a surge of excitement, a flicker of hope. This could be the connection she had been looking for. If Captain Dubois had been an intelligence officer, if he had worked with Nathaniel, perhaps he had known something about the code. She asked the archivist if she could examine the notebook. The archivist hesitated, explaining that it was a delicate artifact, not usually available for public viewing. But Elizabeth persisted, explaining her connection to Nathaniel, her involvement in the investigation, her belief that the notebook might contain vital information. The archivist, moved by her story, her sincerity, finally agreed. He carefully removed the notebook from the display case and handed it to Elizabeth. Elizabeth took the notebook, her hands trembling. It was small, worn, and the leather was cracked and faded. She opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the pages. The notebook was filled with handwritten notes, sketches, maps, and codes. Pages and pages of codes, similar to the one in Nathaniel's dispatch. Elizabeth's heart raced. This was it. This was the key. She spent the next few hours poring over the notebook, comparing the codes, searching for patterns, for similarities. She realized that Captain Dubois had been using a complex substitution cipher, a method of encoding messages by replacing letters with other letters or symbols, based on a predetermined key. And then she found it. A small section in the back of the notebook, where Captain Dubois had written down a series of keywords, phrases, and a date. The date of Nathaniel's disappearance. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. This was the key to the code. She carefully applied the key to Nathaniel's dispatch, substituting the letters and numbers according to Captain Dubois's instructions. And slowly, painstakingly, the message began to emerge. Words, phrases, sentences, a coherent narrative began to take shape. The dispatch was a warning from Nathaniel to his superiors, informing them of a planned assassination attempt. An attempt on the life of a high-ranking French general, a key figure in the Allied war effort. The assassination was to be carried out by Le Corbeau, by James Ashworth, during a secret meeting near the front lines. Nathaniel had discovered the plot, intercepted the communication, and was trying to warn his superiors. But he had been too late. The dispatch had never reached its intended recipient. James had intercepted it, silenced Nathaniel, and then he had carried out the assassination, framing a group of German soldiers for the crime. Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. The truth was even more horrific than she had imagined. James had not only betrayed Nathaniel, he had betrayed his country. He had committed an act of treason that had potentially altered the course of the war. The missing dispatch, now deciphered, provided the final piece of the puzzle, the conclusive evidence that would expose the full extent of James's treachery and bring closure to Nathaniel's story. As she clutched both notebooks, the weight of history, of secrets revealed, settled upon her. The vast silence of the archives a stark contrast to the tumultuous revelations unfolding within their walls. Chapter 12. Echoes in the Trenches. The revelation of the missing dispatch and its contents sent another wave of shockwaves through the already reeling intelligence community. The assassination of General Moreau, no relation to Isabel, previously attributed to enemy action, was now revealed to be the work of James Ashworth, a calculated act of treachery that had far-reaching consequences. Elizabeth, armed with a deciphered dispatch and Captain Dubois's notebook, presented her findings to the authorities, providing irrefutable proof of James's guilt and the full extent of his crimes. The information led to a re-examination of the events surrounding the general's death, uncovering further evidence that corroborated Nathaniel's warning and exposed a wider network of collaborators within the French military. The authorities, initially skeptical of Elizabeth's claims, were now forced to acknowledge her unwavering determination and the undeniable truth of her discoveries. She was lauded as a hero once again, her actions credited with bringing closure to a dark chapter in the war's history and preventing further acts of sabotage and betrayal. But for Elizabeth, the public recognition and the official accolades were secondary. Her primary focus remained on Nathaniel, on honoring his memory, on ensuring that his sacrifice had not been in vain. She felt a need to return to the Somme, to the place where Nathaniel had been stationed, to the trenches where he had fought, and ultimately, where he had been betrayed. She wanted to walk in his footsteps, to understand his final days, to feel his presence in the place where he had drawn his last breath. She contacted Sylvie, sharing her intentions, her desire to visit the Somme. Sylvie, understanding her need for closure, offered to accompany her, providing support and companionship. They traveled to the Somme together, the landscape a stark reminder of the devastation and the loss that had scarred the region. The fields, once green and vibrant, were now barren and pockmarked, crisscrossed by a network of trenches, their walls crumbling, their depths filled with mud and water. Elizabeth and Sylvie walked along the trenches, the silence broken only by the wind whistling through the desolate landscape. Elizabeth felt a profound sense of sadness, a deep connection to the men who had fought and died there, to the suffering they had endured. She imagined Nathaniel, walking these same trenches, his face grim, his heart heavy, his mind filled with the knowledge of the betrayal that was about to unfold. She imagined him writing the dispatch, his hand trembling, his hope fading, his fear growing. They reached the area where Nathaniel's unit had been stationed, the place where he had reportedly been killed in action. Elizabeth looked around, her eyes searching for some sign, some clue, some trace of his presence. But there was nothing. Only the mud, the trenches, the silence. Sylvie placed a hand on her shoulder, her touch gentle and comforting. "He is here, Elizabeth," she said softly. "In the wind, in the earth, in the memories of those who fought alongside him." Elizabeth nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. She knew Sylvie was right. Nathaniel's spirit, his courage, his love, they lived on, in her heart, in the hearts of all those who had known him. As they stood there, in the desolate landscape of the Somme, Elizabeth felt a sense of closure, a sense of peace she hadn't felt before. She had uncovered the truth, exposed the traitor, and brought justice to Nathaniel. She had honored his memory, his sacrifice. But she also knew that the war, the betrayal, the loss, they would always be a part of her. The scars would remain, a constant reminder of the darkness she had faced, the courage she had found, and the love that had endured. As they turned to leave, Elizabeth noticed something glinting in the mud, a small, metallic object partially buried in the trench wall. She bent down and picked it up, her fingers brushing away the dirt. It was a button, a small brass button from a British military uniform. And on the back, barely visible, were engraved two initials. "NB." Elizabeth gasped, her heart pounding. Nathaniel's button. A small, insignificant object, yet it held so much meaning, so much emotion. It was a tangible link to him, a reminder of his presence, a symbol of his life. She clutched the button tightly in her hand, tears streaming down her face. It was a sign, a message from beyond, a reassurance that he was not forgotten, that his love still lived on. As they walked away from the trenches, the sun beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the desolate landscape, Elizabeth felt a sense of hope, a sense of renewal. The war had taken much from her, but it had also given her strength, resilience, and a deeper understanding of the human spirit. She had faced the darkness, and she had emerged, scarred but not broken, her love for Nathaniel enduring, his memory etched forever in her heart. The button, a small token of a life lost, became a symbol of hope and resilience, a reminder that even in the midst of devastation, love and memory could endure, echoing through the silent trenches like a whispered promise. Chapter 13. The Price of Freedom. The discovery of Nathaniel's button on the Somme served as a catalyst for Elizabeth. While it brought a measure of closure, it also ignited a renewed determination to understand the full scope of the spy network James Ashworth had operated. She knew that James had not acted alone, that there were others involved, collaborators who had facilitated his treachery and who remained at large. She returned to Paris, energized and focused, determined to uncover the remaining threads of the conspiracy. She delved back into the documents, meticulously examining every detail, cross-referencing names, dates, and locations. She spent hours at the Archives Nationales, poring over records, maps, and intelligence reports, seeking any clue that might lead her to James's accomplices. Sylvie, ever supportive, continued to offer her assistance, using her connections within the Parisian underworld and the remnants of the resistance to gather information. She introduced Elizabeth to former spies, informants, and resistance fighters, individuals who had operated in the shadows during the war and who possessed a wealth of knowledge about the clandestine activities that had taken place. Through these contacts, Elizabeth began to piece together a picture of a vast and intricate network of spies, informants, and collaborators stretching across France and into other parts of Europe. She learned that James had been recruiting individuals from all walks of life, exploiting their weaknesses, their greed, their ideological beliefs, to gain their cooperation. He had used his position within British intelligence to access sensitive information, to manipulate events, and to protect his network from detection. He had been ruthless and cunning, eliminating anyone who posed a threat to his operation, including Nathaniel. Elizabeth discovered that several high-ranking officials within the French government and military had been complicit in James's activities, providing him with access to classified information, covering up his crimes, and benefiting financially from his treachery. These individuals, driven by greed, ambition, and a desire for power, had betrayed their country and their oaths of office. As Elizabeth uncovered more and more evidence, she realized the scale of the conspiracy was far greater than she had initially imagined. It was a hydra-headed monster, with tentacles reaching into every corner of society. She knew that exposing these individuals would be dangerous, that they would stop at nothing to protect themselves and their secrets. But she was determined to bring them to justice, to ensure that they paid the price for their betrayal. She worked closely with the French authorities, providing them with the information she had gathered, assisting them in their investigations, and testifying before grand juries and tribunals. Her efforts led to a series of arrests, trials, and convictions, exposing a web of corruption and deceit that had undermined the war effort and cost countless lives. The process was long and arduous, filled with challenges and setbacks. Elizabeth faced threats, intimidation, and attempts to discredit her testimony. But she remained steadfast, her resolve unwavering, her determination fueled by her love for Nathaniel and her commitment to justice. As the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place, Elizabeth uncovered a shocking truth. One of James's key collaborators, a high-ranking official within the French Ministry of War, had been responsible for deliberately sabotaging the Allied war effort, providing crucial intelligence to the enemy, and orchestrating the deaths of thousands of soldiers. This individual, a man named Pierre Laval, a fictional character for the story, distinct from the historical figure, had been a master of deception, maintaining a facade of patriotism and loyalty while secretly working to undermine the Allied cause. He had been motivated by a complex mix of ideological beliefs, personal ambition, and a deep-seated resentment towards the British. Elizabeth's discovery of Laval's involvement sent shockwaves through the French government, leading to his immediate arrest and a trial that captivated the nation. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and he was ultimately convicted of treason and sentenced to death. With Laval's conviction, the final chapter of the spy network conspiracy was closed. Elizabeth had brought justice to Nathaniel, exposed the traitors, and helped to heal the wounds of the war. But the victory came at a cost. The process had taken a heavy toll on her emotionally and physically. She had faced danger, betrayal, and the constant reminder of Nathaniel's loss. She knew that she needed time to heal, to recover, to find some peace after the storm. But she also knew that she could never forget that the scars of the war, the scars of betrayal, would always be a part of her. The weight of her discoveries, the knowledge of the depths of human depravity, and the price of freedom, both personal and national, settled upon her, a heavy burden that she would carry forever. Chapter 14. A Stolen Kiss in the Rain. After the tumultuous trials and the exhausting process of bringing the remnants of James Ashworth's spy network to justice, Elizabeth felt a profound need for respite. The constant scrutiny of the press, the weight of her testimony, and the lingering shadows of betrayal had taken their toll. She yearned for a sanctuary, a place where she could escape the memories and find some semblance of peace. Sylvie, ever perceptive and attuned to Elizabeth's needs, suggested a retreat to her small cottage in the countryside, near the village of Giverny. Sylvie had inherited the cottage from her grandmother, a place she often used as a refuge from the noise and chaos of Paris. Elizabeth gratefully accepted the invitation. The prospect of escaping the city, of immersing herself in the tranquility of nature, offered a glimmer of hope, a promise of healing. They traveled to Giverny by train, the journey a soothing balm to Elizabeth's frayed nerves. The landscape, a tapestry of rolling hills, verdant fields, and shimmering rivers, unfolded before her eyes, a welcome contrast to the war-scarred landscapes she had become accustomed to. Sylvie's cottage was charming, a small, stone building nestled amidst a garden overflowing with flowers, their colors vibrant and alive. The air was filled with the scent of roses, lavender, and freshly cut grass, a fragrant reminder of the beauty and resilience of life. Elizabeth immediately felt a sense of calm, a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in months. The cottage was cozy and inviting, its interior filled with rustic furniture, handmade quilts, and Sylvie's collection of art and antiques. They spent their days exploring the surrounding countryside, walking through fields of wildflowers, picnicking by the river, and visiting the nearby village of Giverny with its charming shops and cafes. Elizabeth found solace in the simple rhythms of rural life, in the beauty of nature, in the quiet companionship of Sylvie. One afternoon, as they were returning from a walk, a sudden downpour caught them by surprise. They sought shelter under a large, ancient oak tree, its branches spreading out like a protective umbrella. The rain fell in sheets, drumming on the leaves, creating a curtain of water that surrounded them. Elizabeth and Sylvie stood close together, watching the storm, feeling the cool mist on their faces. Elizabeth, gazing at the rain-swept landscape, felt a wave of emotion wash over her, a mixture of sadness, longing, and a strange sense of hope. She thought of Nathaniel, of their stolen moments together, of their whispered promises, of the love that had blossomed amidst the horrors of war. She remembered a similar day, during the war, when she and Nathaniel had been caught in a sudden downpour near the hospital at Amiens. They had sought shelter in a bombed-out building, its roof partially collapsed, its walls riddled with bullet holes. They had stood close together, shivering in the cold, their bodies touching, their hearts pounding. Nathaniel had taken her hand, his touch gentle and warm, his eyes filled with a love that had transcended the surrounding devastation. He had leaned down and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that had sealed their bond, a promise of a future that had seemed so uncertain, so fragile. It had been a stolen moment, a moment of beauty and connection amidst the ugliness and the loss. Elizabeth closed her eyes, remembering the feel of his lips on hers, the warmth of his breath, the scent of his skin. She could almost feel his presence, as if he were standing there with her, under the oak tree, sheltering her from the storm. She opened her eyes, her gaze meeting Sylvie's. Sylvie was watching her, her expression knowing, understanding. "He is with you, Elizabeth," Sylvie said softly, her voice barely audible above the drumming rain. "Always." Elizabeth nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. She knew Sylvie was right. Nathaniel's love, his memory, would always be a part of her, a guiding light in the darkness. As the rain began to subside, a ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the landscape with a golden glow. A rainbow arched across the sky, a symbol of hope, of renewal, of a promise kept. Elizabeth felt a sense of peace, a sense of acceptance she hadn't felt before. She had faced the darkness, she had uncovered the truth, and she had emerged, scarred but not broken. She turned to Sylvie, a small smile forming on her lips. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "For everything." Sylvie smiled back, her eyes sparkling with warmth and affection. "You are welcome, Elizabeth," she said. "Always." As they walked back to the cottage, hand in hand, the rain having stopped, the sun shining brightly, Elizabeth felt a renewed sense of hope, a belief that even after the darkest storms, there could be beauty, there could be light, there could be love. As the sun warmed their backs, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of wet earth and blooming flowers, Elizabeth felt a lightness in her step, a subtle shift from the weight of the past towards the possibilities of the future. Chapter 15. The Interrogation. Despite the tranquility of Giverny, Elizabeth's mind remained restless. While she cherished the respite and Sylvie's unwavering support, the loose ends regarding James Ashworth's network continued to gnaw at her. She knew that James, despite his conviction, still held information back. He had been the linchpin, but there were others, shadows lurking in the periphery, whose roles remained unclear. Upon returning to Paris, Elizabeth decided to pursue a formal request to interrogate James Ashworth. She felt a compelling need to confront him, to understand his motivations, and to extract any remaining information he possessed about his collaborators. The authorities, initially hesitant, eventually granted her request, recognizing her unique position and the invaluable contributions she had already made to the case. The interrogation took place in a stark, sterile room within the confines of the military prison where James was being held. The room was small, furnished only with a metal table and 2 chairs. A single, bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a harsh, unforgiving light. Elizabeth sat across from James, separated by the cold, impersonal expanse of the table. He looked different than she remembered. The arrogance and charm that had once defined him were gone, replaced by a gaunt, hollow-eyed demeanor. He was dressed in prison garb, his hands shackled, his spirit seemingly broken. But as their eyes met, Elizabeth saw a flicker of the old James, a spark of defiance, a hint of the cunning that had made him such a formidable adversary. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice raspy, devoid of its former warmth. "To what do I owe this pleasure?" "You know why I'm here, James," Elizabeth said, her voice steady, controlled. "I want answers. I want the truth." "The truth?" he scoffed, a bitter smile twisting his lips. "You already have your truth. You have your victory. What more do you want?" "I want to know who else was involved," Elizabeth said, her gaze unwavering. "I want to know the names of your collaborators, the extent of their involvement." James leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowed, assessing her. "You think I'll just tell you?" he said. "You think I'll betray my associates?" "You betrayed your country, James," Elizabeth retorted. "You betrayed your friend. You betrayed everyone who trusted you. Why would you protect anyone now?" He laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Loyalty is a flexible concept, Elizabeth. Especially in my world." "Your world is gone, James," Elizabeth said. "You're finished. There's nothing left for you to protect." He remained silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the table, his mind seemingly wrestling with some internal conflict. Then, he looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and regret. "There are things you don't understand, Elizabeth," he said, his voice low. "Things you can't possibly comprehend. The forces at play, the pressures, the choices. I understand that you chose to betray your country for personal gain," Elizabeth said. "I understand that you chose to murder your friend to protect your secrets." "Nathaniel was a liability," James said, his voice devoid of emotion. "He was getting too close. He was going to expose everything." "And you couldn't let that happen," Elizabeth said, her voice filled with disgust. He didn't answer. He just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Elizabeth pressed on, determined to extract the information she needed. She questioned him for hours, relentlessly pursuing every lead, every detail, every name that he had mentioned during his trial. He was evasive at first, deflecting her questions, offering vague answers, trying to protect his former associates. But Elizabeth was persistent, her knowledge of the case, her understanding of his methods, her unwavering determination gradually wearing him down. She presented him with evidence, confronted him with inconsistencies in his testimony, challenged his lies. She used every tactic she had learned during her involvement in the investigation, drawing on her intuition, her empathy, and her understanding of human nature. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to crack. He revealed names, dates, locations, details of operations, the identities of individuals who had played key roles in his network. He spoke of high-ranking officials, wealthy businessmen, influential socialites, individuals who had used their positions and their connections to facilitate his espionage activities. He described a web of corruption and deceit that stretched across France and into other parts of Europe, a network that had operated with impunity for years. As he spoke, Elizabeth felt a mixture of anger, disgust, and a strange sense of sadness. She saw the toll that his actions had taken, not only on his victims, but also on himself. He was a broken man, stripped of his power, his prestige, his illusions. Finally, after hours of intense questioning, he fell silent. He had revealed everything he knew, or at least everything he was willing to reveal. Elizabeth looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and contempt. "Was it worth it, James?" she asked softly. "Was all this worth the price you paid?" He didn't answer. He just stared at the table, his face etched with regret, his silence a testament to the devastating consequences of his choices. The stark room, with its harsh light and the weight of unspoken truths, seemed to amplify the emptiness of his defeat, the finality of his isolation. Chapter 16. Across the Barricades. The information gleaned from James Ashworth's interrogation triggered another wave of investigations and arrests. Elizabeth, though exhausted from the relentless pursuit of justice, continued to assist the authorities, providing context, insights, and her unique understanding of the spy network's operations. As the net tightened around the remaining collaborators, one name emerged repeatedly, a name that sent a shiver of apprehension down Elizabeth's spine: Antoine Dubois. Antoine was Sylvie's cousin, a shadowy figure who had always been on the periphery of Sylvie's life. Elizabeth had met him briefly on a few occasions, finding him charming yet unsettling, his eyes holding a guarded, almost calculating quality. Sylvie had always been evasive about Antoine, deflecting questions about his work and his connections, hinting at a strained relationship and a past shrouded in secrecy. The evidence against Antoine was circumstantial but compelling. He had been linked to several individuals within James Ashworth's network, his name appearing in coded communications and financial records. He had also been seen meeting with James on several occasions, both before and after Nathaniel's death. Elizabeth, torn between her loyalty to Sylvie and her commitment to uncovering the truth, decided to confront Sylvie about Antoine. She knew it would be a difficult conversation, potentially damaging to their friendship, but she felt she had no choice. She arranged to meet Sylvie at Le Chat Noir, the cabaret where they had first reconnected after Nathaniel's letter had surfaced. The familiar setting, with its dimly lit interior and the melancholic strains of piano music, brought back a flood of memories, both bittersweet and poignant. Sylvie greeted her warmly, but Elizabeth could sense a tension in her demeanor, a guardedness that had not been there before. They sat at their usual table, the conversation initially light and superficial. But as the evening progressed, Elizabeth steered the topic towards Antoine. "Sylvie," she said, her voice hesitant, "I need to ask you something about Antoine." Sylvie's expression changed, her eyes narrowing slightly, a flicker of apprehension in their depths.
"Antoine?"
she said, her voice guarded. "What about him?" Elizabeth took a deep breath. "He's been implicated in James Ashworth's network," she said. "There's evidence linking him to the conspiracy." Sylvie's face paled, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for her glass of wine. "Evidence?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What evidence?" Elizabeth explained what she had learned, the coded communications, the financial records, the witness testimonies. She watched Sylvie's face as she spoke, seeing the conflict, the pain, the disbelief warring within her. Sylvie remained silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the swirling liquid in her glass. Then, she looked up at Elizabeth, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resignation. "I knew," she said softly, her voice choked with emotion. "I suspected, but I didn't want to believe it." Elizabeth's heart sank. She had hoped, against all odds, that Antoine was innocent, that Sylvie's loyalty had not been misplaced. He was always involved in things," Sylvie continued, her voice trembling. "Secret things. Dangerous things. I tried to stay away. I tried to pretend I didn't know. But you did know, Elizabeth said, her voice gentle but firm. Sylvie nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. He used me, she said. He used my connections, my contacts, my reputation.
He manipulated me.
Elizabeth reached across the table and took Sylvie's hand, her touch offering comfort and support. I'm so sorry, Sylvie, she said. I know this is difficult. Sylvie squeezed her hand, her tears flowing freely now. He threatened me, she said. He said if I didn't cooperate, he would hurt me. Hurt those I cared about. Elizabeth felt a surge of anger, a fierce protectiveness towards her friend. Antoine had exploited Sylvie's loyalty, her vulnerability, her love for her family. He won't hurt you anymore, Sylvie, Elizabeth said, her voice firm. He's going to be arrested. He's going to face justice. Sylvie looked at her, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and relief. Thank you, Elizabeth, she said. For telling me. For helping me. The authorities apprehended Antoine shortly thereafter. He initially denied any involvement in the spy network, but when confronted with the overwhelming evidence, he eventually confessed, revealing his role in facilitating James Ashworth's operations and providing crucial intelligence to the enemy. His arrest and subsequent conviction brought a sense of closure to Elizabeth and Sylvie, but it also left a deep scar on their friendship. The betrayal, the deception, the manipulation they had created a chasm between them, a distance that seemed impossible to bridge. They remained friends, but the easy camaraderie, the shared laughter, the unspoken understanding they were gone, replaced by a cautiousness, a guardedness, a lingering sadness. The cabaret, once a place of solace and shared confidences, now echoed with the unspoken tension between them, the music a poignant reminder of the fractured trust and the enduring pain of betrayal. Chapter 17. The Scars of Ypres. The final threads of James Ashworth's spy network had been untangled, the perpetrators brought to justice, and the secrets of the war, at least those connected to Nathaniel's death, laid bare. Elizabeth, though emotionally drained, felt a sense of accomplishment, a sense of having fulfilled her promise to Nathaniel, to honor his memory and bring closure to his story. But despite the resolution of the case, a lingering unease remained. She found herself increasingly drawn to the broader context of the war, to the millions of lives that had been affected, to the countless stories of courage, sacrifice, and loss that remained untold. She decided to visit Ypres, a city in Belgium that had been at the center of some of the fiercest fighting on the Western Front. She had heard stories of the battles that had raged there, of the unimaginable horrors that had been endured, of the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. She traveled to Ypres alone, seeking a solitary pilgrimage, a chance to reflect on the war, on its impact, on its legacy. The city, though partially rebuilt, still bore the scars of the conflict, its buildings pockmarked with bullet holes, its streets echoing with the ghosts of the past. Elizabeth visited the battlefields surrounding Ypres, the vast cemeteries, the memorials, the museums. She walked through the trenches, the mud still clinging to her boots, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and the lingering memory of death. She stood at the Menin Gate Memorial, a massive archway inscribed with the names of over 54,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers who had died in the Ypres salient and whose bodies had never been found. She read the names, row upon row of them, each representing a life lost, a story untold, a future extinguished. She attended the last post ceremony, a nightly ritual held at the Menin Gate, where buglers play the traditional military lament, a tribute to the fallen. The sound of the bugles, echoing through the silent city, brought tears to her eyes, a profound sense of grief and remembrance washing over her. As she explored Ypres, Elizabeth met with local residents, historians, and veterans, listening to their stories, learning about their experiences, gaining a deeper understanding of the war's impact on the region and its people. She learned of the resilience of the city's inhabitants, who had endured years of bombardment, occupation, and hardship. She heard tales of courage, of sacrifice, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the face of unimaginable adversity. She visited a small, family-run museum, dedicated to the memory of the soldiers who had fought and died in the area. The museum was filled with artifacts, photographs, letters, and personal belongings, each telling a story of a life touched by the war. Elizabeth was particularly moved by a display case containing a collection of letters written by soldiers to their families, their words filled with a mixture of hope, fear, longing, and love. She read the letters, her heart aching for the young men who had written them, for the families who had received them, for the lives that had been forever altered by the conflict. As she spent time in Ypres, Elizabeth began to understand the war in a new way, a way that transcended the personal story of Nathaniel and his betrayal. She saw the war as a vast, complex tapestry of human experience, woven with threads of courage, sacrifice, loss, and resilience. She realized that the scars of the war, both physical and emotional, would never fully heal, that the memory of the conflict would endure for generations to come. But she also saw the power of remembrance, the importance of honoring the fallen, of learning from the past, of striving for a future where such horrors would never be repeated. As she prepared to leave Ypres, Elizabeth felt a sense of profound sadness, but also a sense of hope. She had come to this place seeking closure, seeking understanding, and she had found it, not in the answers to her questions, but in the stories of the people she had met, in the resilience of the human spirit, in the enduring power of remembrance. The city, with its haunting beauty and its silent witnesses to the past, had offered her a deeper understanding of the war's enduring legacy, a legacy that extended far beyond the personal tragedies and triumphs she had uncovered. Chapter 18. A Love Forbidden. Returning to Paris from Ypres, Elizabeth carried with her a deeper understanding of the war's magnitude and its lasting impact. While she had sought solace and reflection in the historical landscape, the city of Paris itself began to offer unexpected encounters that stirred emotions she thought long buried. One evening, while walking along the Seine, she noticed a familiar figure sketching in a small notebook. He was a tall, lean man with dark hair, a neatly trimmed beard, and eyes that seemed to hold a depth of both sadness and intensity. It was Jean-Luc, a French artist she had met briefly during the war at a makeshift hospital where he was recovering from a gas attack. He had lost his brother, a soldier, in the early days of the conflict, a loss that had profoundly affected him. Elizabeth approached him cautiously, unsure if he would remember her.
Jean-Luc?
She said softly. He looked up, his eyes widening in recognition. Elizabeth, he said, a faint smile touching his lips. It's good to see you. They fell into conversation, reminiscing about their brief encounter during the war, sharing their experiences since then. Elizabeth learned that Jean-Luc had continued to pursue his art, finding solace and expression in his work. He had exhibited his paintings in several galleries, gaining recognition for his evocative depictions of the war's impact on the human spirit. As they talked, Elizabeth felt a connection with Jean-Luc, a shared understanding of loss and resilience that transcended their different backgrounds and experiences. She found herself drawn to his quiet intensity, his artistic sensibility, his ability to see beauty amidst the darkness. They began to meet regularly, walking along the Seine, visiting museums, attending concerts, and sharing quiet dinners in small cafes. Elizabeth found herself opening up to Jean-Luc, sharing her thoughts, her feelings, her memories of Nathaniel, her struggles with the aftermath of the spy network investigation. Jean-Luc listened patiently, offering his support, his understanding, and a gentle empathy that helped Elizabeth to feel less alone. He shared his own experiences, his grief over his brother's death, his struggles to find meaning and purpose in a world scarred by war. As their friendship deepened, Elizabeth realized that she was developing feelings for Jean-Luc, feelings that went beyond friendship, feelings that stirred a longing she thought she had buried with Nathaniel. She was hesitant at first, conflicted by her loyalty to Nathaniel's memory, by the fear of betraying the love they had shared. But she also knew that she couldn't remain trapped in the past, that she deserved to find happiness, to experience love again. One evening, as they were walking through the Luxembourg Gardens, the setting sun casting a golden glow over the fountains and the flower beds, Jean-Luc stopped and turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of tenderness and uncertainty. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice hesitant, I need to tell you something." Elizabeth's heart quickened. She knew what was coming, and she felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. I've fallen in love with you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. She had hoped, she had dreamed, but hearing the words spoken aloud, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, filled her with a joy she hadn't felt in years. I love you too, Jean-Luc," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. He reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle and warm. They stood there for a long moment, their eyes locked, their hearts beating in unison. Then, he leaned down and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that sealed their bond, a promise of a new beginning, a love born out of shared loss and resilience. But their newfound love was not without its challenges. The war had left deep scars, not only on the landscape but also on the hearts and minds of the people. There were prejudices, resentments, and lingering suspicions between the French and the British, a legacy of the conflict and the betrayals that had occurred. Elizabeth and Jean-Luc faced opposition from some of their friends and family, who questioned their relationship, who saw it as a betrayal of their respective nations of their pasts. There were whispers, rumors, and accusations. Some of Elizabeth's British acquaintances saw her relationship with Jean-Luc as a betrayal of Nathaniel's memory, a rejection of her own heritage. Some of Jean-Luc's French friends and family saw her as an outsider, a reminder of the war and the suffering it had caused. But Elizabeth and Jean-Luc were determined to overcome these obstacles, to prove that love could transcend national boundaries, that healing could come from unexpected places. They faced the opposition with courage and grace, refusing to be swayed by the prejudices and the resentments of others. They demonstrated their love and commitment to each other, openly and honestly, showing the world that their bond was stronger than any societal pressure or historical animosity. Slowly, gradually, they began to win over their doubters, their love and their resilience serving as an inspiration to others, a testament to the power of human connection to overcome even the deepest divisions. The gardens, with their vibrant beauty and their peaceful atmosphere, became a symbol of their blossoming love, a love that defied the odds, a love that dared to bloom amidst the lingering shadows of the past. Chapter 19. The Reckoning. As Elizabeth and Jean-Luc navigated the complexities of their burgeoning relationship, a sense of closure began to settle upon the loose ends of the war that had so profoundly impacted their lives. The trials of those implicated in James Ashworth's spy network had concluded, with sentences ranging from long prison terms to, in a few cases, execution. The public furor had subsided, replaced by a collective desire to move forward, to rebuild, to heal. However, one final reckoning awaited Elizabeth, a personal confrontation that she knew was inevitable. She received a letter from James Ashworth, requesting a final meeting. He was nearing the end of his appeals process, his execution date looming. Elizabeth was hesitant at first. She had no desire to see him again, to revisit the pain and betrayal he had caused. But she also felt a sense of obligation, a need to understand his final thoughts, to perhaps find some semblance of closure, not for him, but for herself. She agreed to the meeting, arranging it through the prison authorities. She met him in the same stark, sterile room where she had interrogated him before. He looked even more gaunt and defeated than he had previously, his eyes devoid of any spark, his spirit utterly broken. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice a mere whisper, devoid of any inflection. "Thank you for coming." "Why did you want to see me, James?" Elizabeth asked, her voice devoid of emotion, her gaze unwavering. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers, as if seeking some sign of understanding, some glimmer of forgiveness. "I wanted to apologize," he said, his voice barely audible. "For everything." Elizabeth was surprised. She had not expected this. She had expected defiance, anger, perhaps even a final attempt at manipulation. But not remorse. "Is it genuine, James?" she asked, her voice skeptical. "Or is this just another performance?" He shook his head slowly. No, he said. No more performances. It's too late for that. He paused, his gaze dropping to the table, his hands clasped tightly together. I've had a lot of time to think, he said, to reflect on what I did, on who I was.
And?
Elizabeth prompted, her voice still guarded. And I was wrong, he said, his voice cracking with emotion. I was blinded by ambition, by greed, by a twisted sense of patriotism. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a deep sadness, a profound regret. I betrayed my country, he said. I betrayed my friend. I destroyed lives, including my own. Elizabeth remained silent, watching him, listening to his words, trying to discern the truth from the lies, the sincerity from the manipulation. I know I can't undo what I've done, he continued. I know I can't make amends. But I wanted you to know that I am sorry.
Truly sorry.
Elizabeth felt a wave of emotion wash over her, a mixture of anger, sadness, and pity. She saw the broken man before her, stripped of his power, his illusions, his future. I believe you, James, she said finally, her voice soft but firm. I believe you are sorry. But that doesn't change anything. It doesn't bring Nathaniel back. It doesn't erase the pain you caused. He nodded, tears welling up in his eyes.
I know, he said.
I know. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the past, the weight of their shared history, hanging heavy in the air. I hope you find peace, Elizabeth, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I hope you find happiness. Elizabeth looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and forgiveness. She couldn't forgive him for what he had done, not entirely, but she could acknowledge his remorse, his humanity, his brokenness. Thank you, James, she said. I hope you find peace as well. She stood up to leave, her heart heavy but also lighter. She had faced her betrayer, she had heard his confession, and she had found a measure of closure, a sense of release. As she walked out of the prison, leaving James Ashworth to face his fate, she knew that the scars of the war, the scars of betrayal, would always be a part of her. But she also knew that she had survived, that she had found strength, resilience, and even love amidst the darkness. The stark walls of the prison, a symbol of confinement and retribution, seemed to fade into the background as she stepped out into the sunlight, a sense of finality washing over her, the reckoning complete. Chapter 20. The Long Road Home. The execution of James Ashworth marked the end of a long and arduous chapter in Elizabeth's life. The spy network had been dismantled, the traitors brought to justice, and the secrets of the war, at least those that had directly impacted her, had been revealed. With the legal proceedings concluded and the public attention fading, Elizabeth felt a profound need to return to England, to reconnect with her roots, to find a sense of belonging after years of living in the shadow of war and betrayal. She and Jean-Luc discussed their future, their desire to build a life together, a life that honored their love and their shared experiences. They decided to make England their home, at least for a time, allowing Elizabeth to reconnect with her family and Jean-Luc to explore new artistic horizons. They traveled to England together, the journey a symbolic crossing, a transition from the darkness of the past to the hope of the future. Elizabeth's family, initially hesitant about her relationship with Jean-Luc, welcomed them with open arms, their reservations melting away in the face of their obvious love and commitment. Elizabeth and Jean-Luc settled in a small cottage in the countryside, not far from Nathaniel's family estate. The landscape, rolling hills and verdant fields, reminded Elizabeth of the beauty and tranquility that Nathaniel had so cherished, a connection to his memory that she found comforting. Jean-Luc, inspired by the English countryside, immersed himself in his art, creating a series of paintings that captured the essence of the landscape, its beauty, its resilience, its enduring spirit. His work gained recognition, his exhibitions drawing acclaim for their emotional depth and their unique perspective. Elizabeth, while supporting Jean-Luc's artistic endeavors, found herself drawn to a new calling. She began to volunteer at a local hospital, working with veterans who were struggling to cope with the physical and emotional scars of the war. She found solace in helping others, in sharing her own experiences, in offering comfort and support to those who had endured similar traumas. She discovered a talent for healing, a gift for empathy and understanding that had been forged in the crucible of her own experiences. She became a beacon of hope for the veterans, a living testament to the power of resilience, the possibility of finding peace and purpose after enduring unimaginable loss. One day, while walking through the grounds of Nathaniel's family estate, which had been opened to the public as a memorial to those who had served in the war, Elizabeth came across a small, secluded garden. In the center of the garden stood a newly planted oak tree, a symbol of strength, endurance, and remembrance. Beneath the tree, a small plaque bore an inscription, "In memory of Major Nathaniel Blackwood and all those who sacrificed their lives for freedom and peace." Elizabeth stood before the tree, her heart filled with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. She remembered Nathaniel, his gentle smile, his unwavering kindness, his love for her, his commitment to duty. She remembered the horrors of the war, the betrayals, the losses, the sacrifices. But she also remembered the resilience of the human spirit, the power of love to overcome even the deepest darkness, the possibility of finding healing and hope amidst the ruins. She reached out and touched the rough bark of the oak tree, feeling a connection to Nathaniel, to the past, to the future. She knew that his memory would live on, not only in her heart, but also in the hearts of all those who had been touched by his life, by his sacrifice. As she stood there, under the shade of the young oak tree, the sun shining brightly, the birds singing sweetly, Elizabeth felt a sense of peace, a sense of belonging, a sense of coming home. The long road, filled with challenges, betrayals, and losses, had led her to this place, to this moment, to a future filled with hope, with love, with the enduring power of the human spirit. The gentle breeze rustling the leaves of the oak tree seemed to whisper a promise of peace, a benediction on her journey, a testament to the enduring power of love and memory. Epilogue. Years passed. The scars of the war, though still visible on the landscape and in the hearts of those who had lived through it, began to fade. The world moved on, rebuilding, recovering, striving for a future where such horrors would never be repeated. Elizabeth and Jean-Luc remained in England, their love deepening, their bond strengthening with each passing year. They built a life together, a life filled with art, music, laughter, and a shared commitment to making the world a better place. Jean-Luc's art flourished, his paintings gaining international recognition, his work exhibited in galleries and museums around the world. He captured the beauty of the English countryside, the resilience of the human spirit, and the enduring power of love in his evocative and emotionally resonant canvases. Elizabeth continued her work with veterans, becoming a leading advocate for their rights and their well-being. She established a foundation dedicated to providing support and resources for those struggling with the physical and emotional wounds of war, her efforts earning her widespread respect and admiration. They often visited the small garden on Nathaniel's family estate, tending to the oak tree that had been planted in his memory. The tree grew tall and strong, its branches spreading out like protective arms, a symbol of enduring life, of remembrance, of hope. One sunny afternoon, as they sat beneath the shade of the oak tree, Elizabeth, now a woman in her late 70s, her hair silvered with age, her eyes still sparkling with the same intelligence and compassion that had defined her throughout her life, turned to Jean-Luc, her hand resting gently on his. "We've had a good life, haven't we?" she said softly, her voice filled with a mixture of contentment and gratitude. Jean-Luc smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners, his love for her as strong and as unwavering as it had been on the day they had first met. "We have," he said, "a very good life." They sat in silence for a moment, their hands clasped together, their hearts filled with a love that had endured the tests of time, of war, of betrayal, of loss. Elizabeth looked up at the branches of the oak tree, the sunlight filtering through the leaves, casting dappled patterns on the ground. She thought of Nathaniel, of his sacrifice, of his enduring spirit. She thought of all those who had lost their lives in the war, of all those who had suffered, of all those who had fought for freedom and peace. And she felt a sense of gratitude, a sense of peace, a sense of completion. The journey had been long and arduous, filled with challenges and heartbreak, but it had also been filled with love, with resilience, with hope. She had honored Nathaniel's memory. She had uncovered the truth. She had brought justice to the guilty, and she had found a love that had sustained her, healed her, and given her a life filled with purpose and meaning. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the countryside, Elizabeth leaned her head against Jean-Luc's shoulder, her heart filled with a profound sense of peace, a sense of coming home. The oak tree, a silent witness to their enduring love, stood tall and strong, its leaves rustling gently in the breeze, a symbol of hope, of remembrance, of a future filled with promise. The long journey was over. The wounds had healed, and love, in all its forms, had triumphed.